The edit modes, Shuffle, Spot, Slip, and Grid, determine how regions behave when edited by the edit tools. Let's check out Slip first. I'm going to use the Grabber tool. I'm going to click and drag this region. You'll note that I can move it freely over top of other regions. I can leave space between regions. Also note how the automation is moving with that region. If I use the trimmer, I can freely trim without being constrained by the grid or anything else. Let's check out Shuffle mode now. Shuffle mode restricts placement of regions so that they snap to each other end to end. So if we take the Grabber tool and now try to move this, it'll only allow you to snap it to the end of this region here, or in between these two regions. If I click and drag, it'll put it right in between these regions and push this one back. If I trim the region and cut the beginning of this region off, you'll see these regions move forward. In fact, all of these regions on the whole track move forward. Let's check out Spot mode. I'll use the Grabber tool. And as soon as I try to move this region with the Grabber tool, the Spot dialog opens up. In this window, we can tell Pro Tools where we want this region to be moved to. And we can tell it using bars and beats, minutes and seconds, or samples. We can also tell it to go back to its original timestamp, that is, where it was originally recorded when you first recorded this track. You can just click this arrow and it'll set that right there. Click OK. The same goes for the trimmer. If you try and trim a track here, you can set where you want the ending point or the start point if you clicked near the beginning of this region. And I'm going to cancel out of that. Let's move on to the grid mode. When you're in grid mode, your edits and selections are constrained to the grid, and it's based on the time scale and the grid size. So we're in bars and beats right now, so everything that we select will start on a grid line and end on a grid line. And you can see this up in the main counter here. We're on bar 23, beat 4, and what I selected was the area between there and 28.4, so we have a 5-bar selection. Now this doesn't just apply to selections, it also applies to edits. So if I take this with the Grabber and move it, you'll see up here that it's moving by beats. And it's constrained to those beats because in the grid value over here we have quarter notes. So there's 4 beats in a measure, and it's constrained to moving at each one of those beats. If we change this grid value to 1 bar, then you'll notice this moving 1 bar at a time. We'll change this back to quarter note. And if we use the trimmer tool, you'll see this in action as well. So I'm going to trim this end, and it goes down by quarter note. Now there are 2 types of grid modes. There's the absolute grid and the relative grid. Absolute grid snaps region start points to the nearest grid line, and that's what we just saw down here when we were doing all these edits. Now, if we select relative grid, that's a little bit different. The regions move in increments of the grid value, but it doesn't matter where the start point is. It'll move in increments of where the start point is. So if a region's start point isn't on the grid, it'll still move in increments of the grid, but it'll keep its relative position to the beat. So let me show you this in action. I'm going to zoom in here first and make sure that our start point isn't on the beat. So I'm going to use slip mode to do that. Then I'm going to go over to relative grid and move this along. And you'll see with the bar lines here how this moves. It's moving in increments of the grid, but keeping its relative position. And speaking of these bar lines or grid lines, we can activate those or deactivate them simply by clicking here on the current time scale. So there's some shortcuts to get around the edit modes. Shuffle is F1, slip is F2, spot is F3, and grid is F4. You can press F4 to toggle between absolute and relative grid. Now if you're in grid mode and you want to temporarily suspend grid mode and switch over to slip while you're dragging a region, all you need to do is press the Command key on a Mac or the Control key on a Windows machine, and you won't be constrained to the grid. There's another cool feature called Snap to Grid that you can activate while you're in any other edit mode. So let's say we're in slip mode, but we actually want to snap this to the grid. So we can press Shift and click on Grid, and that activates Snap to Grid. You can also use the keyboard shortcuts, pressing F4 with F1 to combine Shuffle and Grid, F2 and F4 to combine these two, F3 and F4 to combine Spot and Grid. So let me give you an example of this. Maybe you want to be working in slip mode, but you want to highlight exactly one beat of a measure. So if we shift click and get grid and slip happening together, we can go and select, using the selector, that exact beat that we want to move. Now if we separate this part of the region, I'll choose Edit, Separate Region, and then use the grabber tool, we can slide this in slip mode even though we're also in snap to grid mode. That's pretty slick. There's one other key command that I like a lot. It's called Shuffle Lock. And this mode disables all key commands and control surface switches for shuffle mode. Thus, it prevents you from entering shuffle mode ever. I think that's handy because sometimes shuffle mode can really mess with your timing if you end up trimming or moving regions around in shuffle mode and you're not aware that you're in shuffle mode. So, to turn on Shuffle Lock, go up to the Shuffle button and Command click it on a Mac or Control click it on a Windows machine, and you'll see a little lock in the Edit Mode button right here. So there you have it, the power of the edit modes. Understanding these modes is extremely important when learning how to edit in Pro Tools, and I recommend spending some time working with them and following the examples in this video several times to really grasp their different powers.